The rain pelted Frank Harrison's face as blood trickled down his temple. His pickup truck lay overturned in the ditch, smoke rising from the crumpled hood. Dragging himself along the muddy roadside, Frank spotted a dark shape near the shelter's back fence. A German shepherd, emaciated and bloody, fur matted with what looked like old burns across its flank. The dog's eyes, one amber, one clouded with injury, locked onto Frank's with uncanny recognition. Despite its own broken body, the dog struggled to stand, limping toward Frank with military precision. A tattered collar hung loosely around its scarred neck, a single dog tag dangling. "Easy, boy," Frank whispered, his combat-trained fingers reaching for the tag. When he read the inscription, his blood ran cold. In that moment, Frank knew, if they didn't save each other, neither would survive the night. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Frank Harrison hadn't always been a shadow of a man. At 45, his once powerful frame still carried the muscle memory of 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. But now it also bore the invisible weight of what the VA doctors clinically labeled as severe post-traumatic stress disorder with comorbid depression. Frank called it hell, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way a car backfiring sent him diving for cover on Main Street, much to the discomfort of the good people of Millfield, Virginia. He lived alone in a small ranch house on the outskirts of town, a half-mile from the nearest neighbor, just how he liked it. His pension and disability checks covered the basics. The bourbon handled the rest. 7 years since his honorable discharge, and Frank still kept his boots aligned perfectly at the foot of his bed each night, ready for an enemy that wouldn't stop following him home. Before finding the dog, Frank's only regular human contact had been with Betty Wilson, the 70-year-old widow next door who insisted on bringing over casseroles despite his protests and his bi-monthly check-ins with the VA hospital in Richmond. Betty had lost her husband in Vietnam and seemed to recognize something in Frank's eyes that most civilians missed. She never asked about his service, never thanked him for it either. Instead, she talked about her garden and complained about the deer eating her tomatoes, ordinary conversations that occasionally anchored Frank to the present. The dog was different from any German shepherd Frank had seen during his service. Military working dogs were peak physical specimens, precision instruments of war. This animal was a wreck, ribs visible through patchy fur, scars crisscrossing its body in deliberate patterns. Yet there was something in its bearing, the way it held its head, that spoke of training and purpose beneath the abuse. Doctor. Sarah Mitchell had seen her share of injured animals at her veterinary clinic, but something about the German shepherd made her blue eyes narrow with professional concern and something else. Recognition. She'd examined the microchip twice, made phone calls with her office door closed, returning with a carefully neutral expression that didn't quite hide her unease. "This isn't just any German shepherd," she'd told Frank that first night. This dog was military, special forces from the looks of it, part of a program called Canine Warriors, highly classified, highly trained, and someone went to great lengths to make him disappear. What Sarah didn't say, what Frank read in her hesitation, was that whoever had tried to erase this dog's existence might not appreciate Frank bringing him in from the rain. And what neither of them yet realized was how the dog, soon to be called Shadow, would become the center of a storm that had been brewing long before that rainy night on a back road in Virginia. Colonel Ryan Thompson had also been watching the forecast that night, but for very different reasons than Frank Harrison. He's severely malnourished, dehydrated, with multiple partially healed fractures, Dr. Sarah Mitchell explained, her voice clinical but her eyes soft with concern as she moved her hands gently over the sedated German shepherd. These burn marks are consistent with shock collars, high voltage, military grade. And these scars, They're methodical, not accidental. Frank stood rigid beside the examination table, his jaw clenched tight. The fluorescent lights of the veterinary clinic made the dog's injuries appear even more stark against his dull coat. Outside, rain continued to drum against the windows, the small-town Virginia night as dark as Frank's expression. "Will he make it?" Frank asked, surprised by how much he cared about the answer. Sarah's gloved hands paused over a particularly nasty scar along the dog's flank. "He's a fighter. But he'll need surgery for this leg, antibiotics, proper nutrition, intensive care." She glanced up at Frank. "It won't be cheap, and I'm guessing you don't have pet insurance." Frank almost laughed at that. He barely had health insurance for himself. His last credit card was maxed out 3 months ago, and his truck, now likely totaled in the ditch, had been on its last legs anyway. "I'll figure something out," he said, reaching out hesitantly to touch the dog's ear. It twitched slightly under his fingers. Sarah watched this interaction with a curious expression before turning to a computer terminal. "Let me scan this microchip again. Maybe we can find out who did this to him." The scanner beeped as it passed over the bump between the dog's shoulder blades. Sarah frowned at the screen, then tapped a few keys. "That's odd," she murmured. "This isn't a standard registration chip. It's military." She looked up at Frank. "Were you in the service?" Frank nodded stiffly. "Marines, 3 tours." Something in Sarah's expression shifted. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into her office. Left alone with the sedated dog, Frank studied its face. German Shepherds had been a common sight in Afghanistan and Iraq, the preferred breed for detecting explosives, patrolling compounds, and sometimes, when things went to hell, for dragging wounded soldiers to safety. This one, despite its battered condition, had the facial structure of the best military working dogs, intelligent, alert, even in unconsciousness. "What happened to you?" Frank whispered. The dog's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Sarah returned with a folder and a troubled expression. "The chip registration is classified, but I have contacts. This dog was part of a special program called Canine Warriors, elite dogs trained for special operations. They undergo enhanced training." "Enhanced?" Frank repeated, the military euphemism all too familiar. "These aren't just bomb sniffers, Frank. They're trained to operate semi-independently in combat zones to make tactical decisions. The program was controversial even within the military." Frank's hand moved unconsciously to the dog's paw. "So what's he doing half dead outside a shelter in Virginia?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Sarah closed the folder. "Officially, all canine warriors are either active duty or—" She hesitated. "Decommissioned under strict protocols." The way she said decommissioned made Frank's stomach turn. He knew what happened to military equipment deemed no longer useful. "I'm keeping him," Frank said suddenly, surprising himself as much as Sarah. "Frank, you need to understand, this isn't just a stray. Whoever had him might come looking, and his care won't be simple. He's been traumatized physically and mentally." Frank looked down at the dog again, at the methodical pattern of scars, the precise cruelty they represented. "Yeah, well, that makes 2 of us." That night, Frank slept on the clinic floor beside the dog's kennel, waking at every whimper and growl. The German Shepherd's dreams seemed as violent as his own, legs twitching in phantom runs, teeth baring at invisible enemies. When the dog woke with a start around 3 a.m., eyes wild and disoriented, Frank spoke to him in the same low, steady voice he'd used with young Marines fresh from their first firefight. "You're safe now. It's over. You're safe." The dog's eyes locked onto Frank's, something like recognition flickering in their depths, before he settled back into uneasy sleep. By morning, Frank had named him Shadow. 3 days later, Shadow underwent surgery for his leg. Doctor. Sarah, showing a kindness Frank had almost forgotten existed in the world, worked out a payment plan that Frank knew he couldn't honor but accepted anyway. Shadow recovered in Frank's small house, the two of them establishing a wary routine of medication, short walks, and silent companionship. On the 4th day, as Frank was changing Shadow's bandages, someone knocked on his door. Frank froze. Nobody knocked on his door. Betty Wilson always called first, respecting his need for advance warning. The VA sent letters, not people. He hadn't ordered anything. Shadow's ears pricked forward, his body tensing despite his injuries. Moving silently to the window, Frank peered through the blinds. 2 men in pressed khakis and polo shirts stood on his porch. Their haircuts and postures screamed military, though they wore no uniforms. "Mr. Harrison," one called through the door. "We understand you recently acquired a German Shepherd. We're here about missing military property." Frank felt his pulse quicken. Shadow had moved to his side, standing despite his bandaged leg, eyes fixed on the door. "Who's asking?" Frank called, his voice steadier than he felt. "We represent Colonel Ryan Thompson, United States Army Special Operations Command. The animal you have is government property, and we're authorized to retrieve it." Frank looked down at Shadow, who was now pressing against his leg, trembling slightly. The dog's eyes never left the door. "I found a stray dog," Frank replied. "He needed medical attention. If you want to claim him, you'll need to show some paperwork." A pause. Then, "Mr. Harrison, this doesn't need to be complicated. The animal is classified military equipment. We can compensate you for any expenses incurred, but the dog must be returned immediately." Shadow's trembling had intensified. Frank placed a hand on his head, feeling the vibration of a suppressed growl. "Come back with papers," Frank said. "Official ones, from a judge or the VA. Until then, I've got nothing to say." Another pause, longer this time. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Harrison." "Very soon." Frank watched through the blinds as the men returned to a black SUV with government plates. Shadow didn't relax until the vehicle had disappeared down the road. That night, Frank called Sarah. "They came for him today," he said without preamble when she answered. "Who?" "Military, or claiming to be. Said Shadow is classified equipment they want back." Sarah was silent for a moment. "Frank, be careful. If this dog is what I think he is, there are people who would go to great lengths to keep the program quiet. What did they do to him, Sarah? What kind of enhanced training leaves scars like that?" She sighed. "I don't know exactly, but there were rumors. Methods that wouldn't pass ethical review for animal treatment. The results were supposedly remarkable, but the cost..." She trailed off. "They're not getting him back," Frank said firmly. "Whatever they did, they don't get to do it again." "I'll see what else I can find out," Sarah promised. "Just watch your back, Frank." After hanging up, Frank sat on his porch steps, Shadow lying beside him with vigilant eyes scanning the darkness. For the first time in years, Frank felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose, of righteous anger on behalf of another living being. "They hurt you," he murmured to Shadow. "Used you up and threw you away when you weren't useful anymore." Shadow's ears twitched toward Frank's voice. In the moonlight, his scarred face looked almost dignified, a veteran of unseen battles. "I know how that feels," Frank added softly, "and I'm not letting them do it again, to either of us." The sound of shattering glass jerked Frank from a restless sleep. His hand instinctively reached for a weapon that wasn't there, heart hammering against his ribs. For a disorienting moment, he was back in Fallujah, mortar fire in the distance, the taste of dust thick in his mouth. Then Shadow's warm weight pressed against his side, anchoring him to reality. The dog was alert, ears forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Frank's bedside clock read 2:17 a.m. Another crash from the kitchen. This wasn't a flashback. Frank slid from bed, motioning for Shadow to stay. The dog's eyes gleamed in the darkness, but he remained still, body tense. Moving silently down the hallway, Frank could make out the outline of a figure rummaging through his kitchen drawers. Without warning, the familiar pressure began building in Frank's chest, the tightening, the tunnel vision, the roaring in his ears that preceded his worst episodes. Not now, he thought desperately. Please, not now. His breath hitched. The intruder turned. And then Shadow was there, sailing past Frank with military precision despite his healing leg. The German Shepherd didn't attack, but positioned himself between Frank and the stranger, his stance protective rather than aggressive. The burglar, a local kid Frank vaguely recognized from town, dropped the wallet he'd been rifling through and bolted out the broken window, but Frank barely noticed. He had slid down the wall to the floor, knees drawn to his chest, fighting the crushing weight of his own mind. The kitchen had disappeared, replaced by burning buildings and the staccato of gunfire. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. A warm weight settled across his legs. Shadow had placed his body over Frank's lower half, head resting heavily on his thigh. The pressure was firm, insistent, grounding. The dog's eyes never left Frank's face, steady and somehow knowing. Gradually, the roaring in Frank's ears subsided. The kitchen swam back into focus. His breathing slowed. When Frank could move again, he realized his hand was buried in Shadow's fur, and the dog hadn't flinched away from his touch. A first. They sat together on the kitchen floor until dawn broke, neither willing to move from this newfound connection. The next morning, Dr. Sarah arrived to check Shadow's surgical site and found Frank installing new locks on his windows. "Rough night?" she asked, noticing the dark circles under his eyes. Frank described the break-in briefly, then hesitated before adding, "Shadow." He stopped it. My episode. It was like he knew exactly what to do. Sarah knelt to examine Shadow, who submitted to her touch with military stoicism. "That's not surprising, actually. The commands came back to me last night. These elite dogs were trained to recognize physiological signs of distress, heart rate changes, breathing patterns, subtle body cues. Like a service dog? Much more advanced. They could anticipate panic attacks, flashbacks, even seizures before they fully manifested." She looked up at Frank. "He's applying his training to you. He's chosen you as his handler." Frank felt a strange tightness in his throat. "I'm not a handler. I can barely handle myself most days." "Well, he seems to disagree." Sarah straightened up. "His leg is healing nicely, by the way. But I discovered something else when I was researching his chip." She pulled a folder from her bag. These dogs weren't just assigned to any units. They were exclusively deployed with Special Forces teams on classified missions. She handed Frank a heavily redacted document. Through the black lines, he could make out phrases like Operation Phantom Shield and Enhanced Canine Cognitive Training. "Where did you get this?" Frank asked, suddenly wary. "I have friends who believe these dogs deserve better than being treated as disposable equipment." She tapped the paper. "This program cost millions to develop. The dogs that survived training were valued assets. They wouldn't just abandon one unless..." "Unless what?" "Unless he saw something they don't want known." Frank looked down at Shadow, who gazed back with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. What had this dog witnessed? What had he been part of? "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice lower. "I received a call from the shelter near where you found him. A man claiming to be Colonel Ryan Thompson left his card asking about a German Shepherd. Military bearing, they said. Very insistent." Frank felt a chill. The men who came here mentioned that name. Thompson oversees the Canine Warriors program. If he's personally involved... She didn't finish the thought. That afternoon, Frank took Shadow for a short walk in his backyard. The dog moved with increasing confidence despite his healing leg, surveying the property with alert attention. Frank watched him, mind churning with questions. On impulse, Frank called out a basic command he remembered from working with military dogs overseas. "Shadow, survey!" The effect was immediate. Shadow's posture transformed, his movements becoming precise and methodical as he began a perimeter check of the yard, exactly as a military working dog would do. Frank stared, stunned by the instant response. He tried another command, more complex. "Shadow, seek and report." Without hesitation, Shadow began a search pattern, nose working efficiently before returning to Frank and sitting at attention, waiting for the next instruction. These weren't simple pet tricks. This was advanced tactical training. Frank spent the next hour testing different commands. Shadow knew dozens, responding to hand signals, verbal cues, even subtle body language. His training was extraordinary, far beyond standard military protocols. "What were you designed for, boy?" Frank murmured. That night, the nightmares came again. Blood and sand and the deafening concussion of IEDs. Frank thrashed in his sheets, trapped between memory and sleep. Shadow's weight settled on the bed beside him, a steady presence in the storm of Frank's mind. But this time, something different happened. As Frank's breathing grew ragged, Shadow placed his paw firmly on Frank's chest, directly over his racing heart. The pressure was calculated, therapeutic. Within minutes, Frank's pulse slowed. For the first time in years, he slept through the night. The next morning, a certified letter arrived. Inside was a formal demand for the return of U.S. government property, specifically one German Shepherd military working dog, identification number CW7734, under penalty of federal prosecution. It was signed by Colonel Ryan Thompson, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. Frank's jaw tightened as he read the threats carefully couched in legal language. Shadow watched him from across the room, head tilted slightly as if gauging Frank's reaction. "They want you back," Frank said, holding up the letter. Shadow's ears flattened against his head. Frank called Sarah immediately. "They're escalating," he told her. "I need to know what I'm dealing with. Who is this Thompson? What exactly was Shadow trained for?" "I'm still working on that," Sarah replied. "But Frank, there's something you should know. When I was examining Shadow yesterday, I found evidence of a previous injury that's unusual. A distinctive scar pattern on his left shoulder that I've only seen once before, on a military working dog that saved its entire unit during an ambush in Kandahar province." Frank froze. "When?" 2014, May. The phone nearly slipped from Frank's suddenly numb fingers. May 2014. The ambush that had ended his military career, the reason he woke up screaming most nights. "Frank, are you there?" "I need to see it," he said hoarsely. "The scar! I need to see it now." An hour later, in Sarah's clinic, Frank stared at the distinctive pattern of healed tissue on Shadow's shoulder. 3 jagged lines, shrapnel wounds from an explosion that had happened half a world away. A fragment of memory surfaced. Dust and blood, and the weight of a dog dragging him behind a crumbled wall seconds before a second blast. A dog that had supposedly died in the attack. Frank sank to his knees, eye level with Shadow, who watched him with that same steady gaze. "It was you," he whispered. "You were there." Outside the clinic window, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot. A tall man in civilian clothes stepped out, his military bearing unmistakable even at a distance. Colonel Ryan Thompson had come to collect his property personally. "Back exit, now!" Sarah's voice cut through Frank's stunned realization as she pulled down the clinic's window blinds. She grabbed Shadow's leash and thrust it into Frank's hand. "My car's behind the building. Take the keys." Frank moved on autopilot, Marine training kicking in. Shadow stayed close to his leg, body tense but disciplined as they slipped through the back hallway and out the service entrance. The parking lot was empty, save for Sarah's faded blue Subaru. "What about you?" Frank asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "I'll stall him, buy you some time." Sarah pressed her car keys into his palm. "Call me tonight. Use the burner phone in the glove compartment." Before Frank could protest, she was gone, heading back inside to face Colonel Thompson. Frank hesitated for only a moment before loading Shadow into the car and driving away, taking the back roads toward Millfield. His mind raced as he drove. Shadow had been there, in Afghanistan, during the ambush that had shattered Frank's unit and left him the sole survivor. How was that possible? The official report had listed all assets as lost in action, including the military working dog assigned to their team. A dog Frank had only vague memories of amid the chaos and trauma of that day. "They lied," he murmured, glancing at Shadow in the passenger seat. The German shepherd watched the road ahead, alert but calm in his presence. "They said you died there." Frank drove aimlessly for nearly an hour before deciding it wasn't safe to return home. Thompson would surely check there first. Instead, he turned down a familiar country lane that led to Betty Wilson's small farmhouse. If anyone would help without asking too many questions, it would be Betty. The elderly widow opened her door before he could knock, ushering them inside with a quick glance at the road behind them. "Trouble follows you like a shadow, Frank Harrison," she said, eyeing the German shepherd. "No pun intended. I just need a place to stay tonight, Betty. I wouldn't ask if—" She waved away his explanation. "Spare room's made up. Always is." She knelt stiffly to look Shadow in the eyes, showing no fear despite his size. "Military dog, ain't he? Got that look about him." Frank shouldn't have been surprised. Betty's late husband had been a handler in Vietnam. She recognized the signs. "Yeah, he is." She nodded, satisfied. "He can stay, too. Dogs are better judges of character than most people." She stood with a slight grimace. "Now, you want to tell me why you're running?" Over Betty's homemade stew, Frank explained the situation. Finding Shadow, the mysterious Colonel Thompson, the realization that this dog might have been part of his past in Afghanistan. Betty listened without interruption, her weathered face giving nothing away. "Thompson," she repeated when he finished. "Ryan Thompson? You know him?" She pursed her lips. "Know of him. My herald corresponded with some of the younger handlers before he passed. Thompson's name came up. Not favorably." "What did they say about him?" "That he valued results over methods. That dogs under his command had unusually short service lives." Her eyes narrowed. "And that he was involved in programs that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable training." Shadow had settled at Frank's feet, but his ears perked up at Thompson's name. "Betty, I think Shadow was there when my unit was ambushed. I think he may have saved my life." Betty studied the dog thoughtfully. "And now you're returning the favor?" That night, Frank slept fitfully in Betty's spare room, Shadow a warm weight against his side. His dreams were fragmented. Explosions, shouted commands, the feeling of being dragged across rough ground. He woke several times, disoriented, to find Shadow watching him intently in the darkness. The burner phone rang at precisely 7 a.m. "Sarah?" Frank answered immediately. "It's me." Her voice was tight. Thompson came to the clinic looking for his dog. He had paperwork, official military documentation for Shadow's transfer to a private contractor. "Did you tell him where we went?" "Of course not. But Frank, he knows about your connection to the dog. He asked if you'd remembered anything from Afghanistan yet." Frank's blood ran cold. What does that mean? I don't know, but he seemed concerned about your memories, specifically. A pause. There's something else. One of my contacts came through with information about Thompson. He was the commanding officer for a black ops project called Phantom Shield that used elite dogs for classified missions, but the program was suspended in 2014 after an incident. What incident? That's just it. The details are classified. But the timing coincides with your ambush in Afghanistan. Frank looked down at Shadow, who met his gaze steadily. Sarah, I need to remember what happened that day. All of it. Memory recovery isn't simple, Frank. Trauma affects how memories are stored. I know. But if Shadow was there, if he's the key to understanding what really happened... Frank trailed off. Thompson is afraid of what I might remember. That means there's something worth remembering. After ending the call, Frank sat on the edge of Betty's guest bed, trying to piece together the fragments of that day in Afghanistan. The official report had cited a routine patrol, an unexpected ambush, multiple casualties. Frank had been found half a mile from the ambush site, severely wounded. No one could explain how he'd gotten there. His memory had always been a blur of noise and pain. But now, with Shadow beside him, certain details were surfacing: the weight of being dragged, a dog's determined panting, the flash of German shepherd fur in the dusty sunlight. Betty knocked softly on the doorframe. "You've got company," she said, her expression grave. "Mike Collins from the police department says he needs to talk to you." Frank tensed. "Did you tell him I'm here?" "I'm old, not stupid," Betty replied with a sniff. "Told him I hadn't seen you, but he's parked across the street watching the house, and he mentioned something about a stolen dog." Through the bedroom window, Frank could see Officer Collins's patrol car idling under the shade of an oak tree. He wasn't alone. Another vehicle was parked behind him, a black SUV with government plates. "Thompson found me," Frank muttered. "Back door's clear," Betty said. "My old truck's in the barn. Keys are in the ignition." Frank looked at her in surprise. "Betty, I can't take your truck." "And if they find out you helped me, let me worry about that." Her eyes, faded blue but sharp as ever, narrowed with determination. "My Harold didn't come back from Vietnam, so some military types could mistreat their dogs. Whatever you and that animal are mixed up in, I suspect you're on the right side of it." 20 minutes later, Frank and Shadow were bouncing down a back farm road in Betty's ancient pickup, heading toward the one place Frank thought they might be safe, an old hunting cabin owned by his former squad mate, the only other member of his unit who'd survived Afghanistan, though he hadn't been present during the ambush. James Mercer had left the military the same year as Frank, but had adjusted better to civilian life. They hadn't spoken in years, but Frank still remembered the standing offer: "If you ever need to disappear for a while, the cabin's yours." No questions asked. The cabin was 30 miles north, deep in the Virginia woods, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that even GPS had trouble finding. Frank drove carefully, watching the rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, occasionally turning to look behind them, as alert as any rear guard. They reached the cabin by mid-afternoon. It was just as Frank remembered: small, rustic, isolated, perfect. Shadow inspected the perimeter while Frank forced the stiff lock and checked inside. The cabin was dusty but secure, stocked with non-perishable food, and, knowing Mercer, probably a weapon or two hidden somewhere. As dusk fell, Frank sat on the cabin's porch steps, Shadow at his side. The German shepherd had been growing increasingly restless throughout the day, pacing and returning to Frank as if trying to communicate something urgent. "What is it, boy?" Frank asked softly. "What are you trying to tell me?" On impulse, Frank went to Betty's truck and retrieved his old military rucksack. Inside was a worn camouflage jacket he'd kept from his service days. He rarely looked at it, the memories too painful, but now he brought it out, holding it toward Shadow. The reaction was immediate. Shadow's posture shifted, his attention completely focused on the jacket. He moved forward cautiously, sniffing it thoroughly before looking up at Frank with an intensity that made Frank's chest tighten. "You recognize this," Frank whispered. "You remember." That night, Frank laid the jacket on the cabin floor. Shadow curled up beside it, his nose occasionally twitching against the fabric. Frank watched him, trying to reconnect with his own fragmented memories of Afghanistan. He must have dozed off because suddenly he was there again. The heat, the dust, the weight of his gear. His unit moving through a narrow valley. The radio crackling with warnings. The first explosion throwing him against a rocky outcrop, and then a flash of fur, a German shepherd racing ahead of the unit, body tense with alert purpose. "Something's wrong," the dog handler had said, watching the animal's behavior. "Caesar's picking up something the detectors missed." Caesar. The name slammed into Frank's consciousness. The dog's name had been Caesar. Frank jerked awake, heart pounding. Shadow, no, Caesar, was watching him, ears forward, completely focused on Frank's face. "Caesar?" Frank whispered. The dog's reaction was unmistakable, a subtle shift in posture, a new alertness in his eyes. He knew that name. Frank's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thompson knows where you are. He's coming. S. Sarah." How had Thompson tracked them? Frank's mind raced. The truck? A tracker on Shadow? It didn't matter now. They had to move. As Frank gathered their meager supplies, another memory surfaced, clearer this time. After the first explosion, chaos had erupted. Gunfire from the ridge lines, his unit scattered, taking cover. The dog handler down, blood pooling beneath him. And Caesar, torn between staying with his fallen handler and responding to the danger threatening the rest of the unit. Frank remembered making eye contact with the dog across the dusty ground, remembered the German shepherd making a decision, racing toward him as a second explosion ripped through their position. The memory stopped there, fragmented by the trauma of his own injuries. But it was enough to confirm what Frank had begun to suspect. Caesar had chosen to save him when his handler couldn't command him, had chosen to disobey protocol to protect the surviving members of the unit. A dog that could make independent tactical decisions, a dog that could prioritize mission objectives without handler input. Wasn't that exactly what the Canine Warriors program had been designed to create? Frank and Shadow slipped out of the cabin minutes before headlights appeared on the distant access road. They moved silently through the woods, the German shepherd leading with confident familiarity, as if night operations through difficult terrain were second nature to him. They reached a small clearing with a view of the cabin just as several vehicles pulled up. Even from a distance, Frank recognized Thompson's tall figure directing men with tactical gear to surround the structure. This wasn't a police operation or even standard military procedure. This looked like a private recovery team. Frank's phone vibrated again. "Coming to you. Bringing help. Stay hidden. S." For hours, Frank and Shadow remained motionless in their concealed position, watching Thompson's men search the cabin and surrounding area. Military discipline kept them both still and silent despite the cold night air and the occasional search team passing within yards of their position. Dawn was breaking when Frank spotted a familiar blue Subaru approaching on the access road, followed by an older model pickup truck. Sarah had arrived, and she wasn't alone. Through his makeshift blind, Frank watched as Thompson intercepted them. Even at this distance, the confrontation appeared tense. Sarah gesturing emphatically, Thompson standing rigid and authoritative. The man who had accompanied Sarah, gray-haired with the unmistakable bearing of a career military officer, showed Thompson something on a tablet that caused a visible reaction. The standoff continued for several minutes before Thompson's posture changed subtly. He nodded curtly and signaled to his men, who began returning to their vehicles. Within 15 minutes, the cabin clearing was empty except for Sarah and her companion. Frank waited an additional 30 minutes before whistling softly, a specific pattern he'd been using with Shadow. The German shepherd's ears perked up, confirming it was safe to move. Now, as they approached the clearing, Sarah spotted them and visibly relaxed. "Frank, thank God." The gray-haired man with her turned, and Frank felt a jolt of recognition. General William Hargrove, former commander of Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan, now retired. Frank had never worked directly under him, but every Marine knew Hargrove's reputation for integrity and his fierce protection of the troops under his command. "Sergeant Harrison," Hargrove acknowledged with a nod. "And I see Caesar made it back to you after all." Frank stared, uncomprehending. "Sir, you know about Caesar? I authorized his deployment with your unit." Hargrove's weathered face revealed nothing. "And I've spent the last 7 years believing he died saving you from that ambush." "Thompson told you he was dead?" "Thompson told everyone Caesar was killed in action. It wasn't until Dr. Mitchell here contacted my office with the dog's identification chip information that I learned otherwise." Hargrove's eyes hardened. "Thompson has some explaining to do about how a presumed dead military asset ended up in his private possession." Shadow Caesar moved forward, approaching General Hargrove with cautious recognition. The general knelt, allowing the dog to sniff his hand before gently examining the healed scars visible through his fur. "What they did to him after Afghanistan," Sarah began, "won't happen again," Hargrove finished firmly. "Colonel Thompson has been relieved of his command pending investigation. The K-9 Warriors program has been suspended." "He won't just let this go, sir," Frank said. "He came after us with a private security team." "Thompson has powerful friends in private military contracting," Hargrove acknowledged, "and Caesar represents a significant investment. But he also represents evidence of potential war crimes, if what I suspect about that ambush is true." Frank felt a chill. "What do you suspect, sir?" Hargrove studied Frank carefully. "That's what I came to ask you, Sergeant. Your memories of that day could be crucial. Caesar was the only witness to what happened after the initial attack. Thompson has worked very hard to keep both of you from comparing notes, so to speak." Frank looked down at Caesar, who gazed back with those intelligent, knowing eyes. "I'm starting to remember, sir. But there are still gaps." "Perhaps together we can fill them," Hargrove said. "But not here. Thompson may return with reinforcements. We need to get you both somewhere secure." As they prepared to leave, Frank knelt beside Caesar, running his hand gently over the dog's scarred head. "We're going to figure this out, boy. Whatever happened back there, whatever they did to you afterward, we're going to make it right." Caesar pressed against Frank's leg, a warm, solid presence. For the first time since Afghanistan, Frank felt something he'd thought lost forever, a sense of purpose, of righteous mission. And underneath it all, the faintest flicker of something even more precious: hope. The Virginia courthouse stood imposing against the bright blue summer sky, its stone columns and broad steps lending gravity to the proceedings about to unfold within. Frank adjusted his tie, borrowed from General Hargrove and feeling like a noose around his neck. In the 3 weeks since their escape from the cabin, events had accelerated with dizzying speed. Thompson had been formally charged with misappropriation of military assets, but his connections had quickly transformed what should have been an internal military investigation into a public civilian hearing about Caesar's ownership. The legal maneuver was clever: shift the focus from Thompson's potential crimes to a simple property dispute. "Remember," Sarah murmured beside Frank on the courthouse steps, "this is about establishing that Caesar isn't just equipment. Your testimony about your shared history is crucial. Frank nodded tightly, his eyes on the German Shepherd sitting perfectly at attention beside Hargrove 20 feet away. Military working dogs weren't allowed in the courtroom, so Caesar would wait outside with a trusted handler from Hargrove's staff. The separation made Frank uneasy. "What if the judge rules against us?" Frank asked, voicing the fear that had kept him awake for days. "One step at a time," Sarah replied. "Thompson's team will present their documentation first. We'll counter with our evidence of abuse and Caesar's connection to you. And the ambush? My memories?" Sarah hesitated. "Hargrove thinks we should hold those cards close for now. If Thompson is hiding what I think he's hiding, we don't want to show our hand too early." Inside, the courtroom was already crowded. Local media had picked up the story, decorated veteran fights for military dog that saved his life, and several news outlets had sent reporters. More surprising was the back row, filled entirely with veterans from the Millfield VFW, led by Betty Wilson in her late husband's service cap. Thompson sat at the plaintiff's table, ramrod straight in an impeccable suit, flanked by 2 attorneys and a man Frank recognized as Dr. Maxwell Krieger, the lead scientist for the Canine Warriors program. Thompson's eyes met Frank's briefly, cold and assessing, before dismissively sliding away. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Eleanor Whitman took her place on the bench. In her 70s, with a reputation for no-nonsense pragmatism, she surveyed the assembled parties with skeptical eyes. "Let me be clear," she began. "While I understand the emotional nature of this case, this court will focus solely on the legal question before us. The rightful ownership of the German Shepherd, designated as military asset CW7734, also known as Caesar. Let's proceed." Thompson's lead attorney, a polished woman named Claire Reynolds, approached the bench first. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter. The dog in question is the property of the United States military, specifically assigned to Colonel Ryan Thompson's command for the Canine Warriors program. We have filed all appropriate documentation." She presented a thick folder of military transfer papers, training records, and acquisition forms, each bearing official stamps and signatures. "Furthermore," Reynolds continued, "this animal represents millions in taxpayer investment and specialized training. Colonel Thompson, as program director, is legally responsible for all assets under his command. The defendant, Mr. Harrison, while perhaps well-intentioned, essentially took possession of government property without authorization." Judge Whitman reviewed the documents, her expression unreadable. "And what about the dog's apparent abandonment? Mr. Harrison found the animal injured near a shelter." "An unfortunate situation, Your Honor. The dog escaped during a training exercise. Colonel Thompson has been actively searching for the animal since its disappearance." Frank clenched his jaw, the lie so blatant he could barely maintain his composure. Sarah placed a warning hand on his arm. "Mr. Chen," the judge addressed Frank's attorney, "your response." Andrew Chen, a soft-spoken but razor-sharp lawyer recommended by Hargrove, approached the bench. "Your Honor, we contend that this case goes far beyond simple property rights. This German Shepherd was presumed dead for 7 years, listed as killed in action in Afghanistan in 2014. We have the official casualty report." He submitted the document which Hargrove had secured through his military connections. Yet somehow, this supposedly dead dog reappeared in Colonel Thompson's private training facility, subjected to what our expert veterinarian will testify was systematic abuse, before being abandoned when no longer useful. Chen's voice remained measured, but his words landed like precise artillery strikes. "Furthermore, this dog saved Sergeant Harrison's life in Afghanistan. Their reunion was not random, but the result of a bond formed in combat." Judge Whitman's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's a compelling narrative, Mr. Chen, but I need evidence, not war stories." "We have evidence, Your Honor. Medical records documenting the abuse, testimony from Dr. Sarah Mitchell about the dog's condition, and most importantly, proof of the dog's original deployment with Sergeant Harrison's unit in 2014. Thompson shifted in his seat, a nearly imperceptible movement that Frank caught only because he was watching for it. The colonel's confident expression had developed the faintest crack. "We'll begin with Colonel Thompson," the judge decided. "Please take the stand." Thompson moved to the witness box with military precision, swearing his oath with practiced solemnity. Under his attorney's careful questioning, he outlined his distinguished career, his leadership of the Canine Warriors program, and his deep personal concern for all dogs under his command. "Caesar was one of our most promising subjects," Thompson explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being believed without question. His training represented a breakthrough in tactical canine deployment. When he went missing, it was a significant loss to the program. "And can you explain the discrepancy in the casualty report?" Reynolds asked. Thompson nodded gravely. "An unfortunate clerical error. In the chaos following the ambush in Afghanistan, Caesar was incorrectly listed as killed in action. When he was recovered later, the paperwork was filed to correct the error, but apparently the original KIA designation remained in some databases." The explanation sounded plausible, and Frank felt a flicker of doubt. Was it possible this was all a misunderstanding? But then he remembered Caesar's scars, the systematic pattern of abuse, and his doubt hardened into certainty. During cross-examination, Chen approached Thompson with deceptive mildness. "Colonel, if Caesar was such a valuable asset, why was he found emaciated, injured, and abandoned? As I said, he escaped during training. We've been searching for him." "Interesting," Chen said. "Because we have testimony from shelter workers that no one inquired about a missing German Shepherd until after Mr. Harrison had already taken the dog for medical treatment." Thompson's jaw tightened. "We were conducting our search through appropriate military channels." "I see. And can you explain these?" Chen produced a series of photographs showing Caesar's injuries, including the distinctive pattern of electrical burns. "Our veterinary expert will testify these are consistent with high-voltage shock treatment well beyond any approved training methods." "I'm not a veterinarian," Thompson replied coldly. "Military working dogs undergo rigorous training that occasionally results in injuries. It's unfortunate but necessary." "Necessary," Chen repeated. "Is it also necessary to falsify casualty reports? Because we have not one but 3 separate documents listing Caesar as killed in action in Afghanistan." For the first time, Thompson's composure wavered visibly. "As I explained, it was a clerical error." "A convenient one," Chen noted, "especially since it meant no one would look for a dog officially listed as dead." When it was Frank's turn to testify, he felt a strange calm descend over him. After weeks of fragmented memories and uncertainty, sitting under oath somehow crystallized his thoughts. He described finding Caesar, the gradual recognition, and the dog's response to military commands. "He saved my life in Afghanistan," Frank stated. "I didn't remember clearly at first. Trauma affects memory, but being with him again has helped me recover those memories." "Objection," Reynolds called. "The defendant is not a medical expert and cannot testify about recovered memories." "I'll rephrase," Chen said smoothly. "Mr. Harrison, can you describe your experience in Afghanistan with this dog?" Frank took a deep breath. "Our unit was on patrol in Kandahar province. Caesar, then attached to our unit under handler specialist James Cortez, alerted to something our equipment hadn't detected. Before Cortez could issue commands, we were hit by an IED." The courtroom was completely silent as Frank continued, his voice steady. "Cortez was killed instantly. I was separated from the unit. Caesar found me, dragged me to cover before a second explosion. He stayed with me, protected me until medevac arrived. Frank's voice caught slightly. I was the only survivor. When I woke up in Germany, they told me everyone and everything had been lost, including the dog. And you believe this is the same dog? Chen asked. I know it is. He has the exact shrapnel scarring from that day. He responds to commands only our unit used. And, Frank hesitated, then continued firmly, he recognizes me, not just as a person, but as someone he protected before. Thompson's attorney approached for cross-examination with calculated skepticism. Mr. Harrison, you've admitted your memories of that day are fragmented. Isn't it possible you're projecting your desires onto this dog, seeing connections that aren't there? No, ma'am, I'm not. You suffer from PTSD, correct? Hallucinations, flashbacks? Frank felt heat rising in his face. Yes to PTSD, no to hallucinations. And isn't it convenient that this dog appeared just when you were at your lowest point? A living connection to your military service, a purpose to fill the void civilian life left you with? Chen stood. Objection? Badgering the witness. Sustained, Judge Whitman said sharply. Ms. Reynolds, confine your questions to relevant facts. Reynolds changed tack. Mr. Harrison, do you have any documentation proving your claims about this dog's identity or its actions in Afghanistan? The documentation says he died there, Frank replied evenly, but he didn't. Someone falsified those reports. So your answer is no, you have no documentation. My answer is that the documentation was deliberately falsified. Reynolds smiled thinly. No further questions. Dr. Sarah Mitchell followed, providing expert testimony about Caesar's injuries and the microchip identification that confirmed his military origins. Her clinical description of the systematic abuse evidenced by the dog's scars and behavior patterns visibly affected several jury members. These injuries are not accidental or the result of standard training, Sarah emphasized. They represent deliberate, repeated application of pain consistent with prohibited training methods. During a brief recess, Frank stood outside with Caesar, who had remained perfectly positioned where Hargrove had left him. The dog leaned slightly against Frank's leg, a subtle gesture of solidarity. We're doing everything we can, boy, Frank murmured. Caesar looked up at him with those knowing eyes, and Frank felt again the strange certainty that the dog understood far more than anyone realized. The courthouse doors opened, and General Hargrove emerged, his expression grim. Thompson's called for a closed session, he told Frank. National security concerns. He's claiming the Canine Warriors program details are classified. Can he do that? Frank asked. Judge Whitman's considering it. If she agrees, you'll be excluded from the remainder of the proceedings. Frank felt his heart sink. He's going to bury this. Not if I can help it, Hargrove replied. I've submitted my own request to testify about the program's oversight or lack thereof. Thompson may have friends in high places, but so do I. As they spoke, a sleek black car pulled up to the courthouse. A man in an expensive suit emerged, followed by 2 military police officers. Frank recognized him immediately. Defense Department Undersecretary James Whelan, Thompson's former commanding officer and longtime ally. Reinforcements have arrived, Hargrove muttered. Thompson's pulling out all the stops. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. Undersecretary Whelan sat prominently behind Thompson, his presence a silent reminder of the powerful interests at stake. Judge Whitman, to her credit, appeared unmoved by the addition of Pentagon brass to her courtroom. Before I rule on Colonel Thompson's request for closed proceedings, she announced, I have one question for both parties. Her stern gaze moved between Thompson and Frank. This case has expanded well beyond a simple ownership dispute. It now involves allegations of falsified military records, mistreatment of government assets, and potential violations of training protocols. She leaned forward slightly. Is there something larger at stake here that I should know about? The silence that followed was deafening. Frank looked at Thompson, whose face had become a mask of controlled tension. The moment stretched, the unspoken truth hovering in the air between them. Finally, Thompson spoke. Your Honor, what's at stake is national security and the integrity of a classified military program. Nothing more. Judge Whitman's gaze shifted to Frank. Mr. Harrison, your perspective? Frank met her eyes steadily. What's at stake, Your Honor, is the truth about what happened in Afghanistan, about who lived, who died, and why. He paused, then added quietly, Caesar is the only witness left who knows what really happened that day, and I believe that's why Colonel Thompson wants him back so badly. Thompson's hand tightened on the edge of the table, knuckles white with pressure. The courthouse fell silent as Judge Whitman considered both men. I'm going to take these requests under advisement, she finally said. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9. Until then, the dog remains in the custody of the court-appointed handler. She nodded toward Hargrove. As everyone rose for the judge's exit, Frank caught Thompson's eye across the courtroom. For the briefest moment, something like fear flickered across the colonel's face, the first genuine emotion Frank had seen from him. Outside, as dusk settled over the courthouse steps, Betty Wilson approached Frank, her husband's service cap clutched in gnarled hands. You did good in there, son, she said, her voice gruff with emotion. But that Thompson fella isn't going down without a fight. Frank nodded, watching Caesar sitting alertly beside Hargrove's car. I know, but neither am I. The other vets and we'll be back tomorrow, Betty promised. Full force. That dog saved one of our own. Far as we're concerned, that makes him one of our own, too. As Betty departed, Sarah joined Frank on the steps. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said quietly, you've already won something important. What's that? She nodded toward Caesar. You found each other again, against impossible odds. That counts for something in this world. Frank watched the German shepherd's profile against the fading light, the proud set of his ears, the vigilant posture despite his many scars. Tomorrow would bring either victory or defeat in the eyes of the law. But Sarah was right. Some victories existed beyond legal definitions. Yeah, he agreed softly. It counts for everything. Judge Whitman's decision came the following morning like a thunderclap. The court has determined that Colonel Thompson's request for classified proceedings has merit. All non-military personnel and those without appropriate security clearance are hereby excused. Frank watched in dismay as the courtroom emptied. Sarah squeezing his shoulder supportively before being ushered out, Betty Wilson shooting Thompson a withering glare as she joined the other veterans filing reluctantly through the double doors. Even Andrew Chen, Frank's attorney, was excluded, classified clearance being one credential he lacked. This is highly irregular, Chen protested. My client has a right to representation. Your client will be represented by JAG counsel, familiar with classified matters, Judge Whitman replied, not unkindly but firmly. I understand this is frustrating, Mr. Chen, but national security protocols are non-negotiable in my courtroom. As the doors closed behind Chen, Frank found himself in a dramatically altered environment. The public gallery now contained only a handful of stone-faced military officers and 2 civilian officials with high-level security badges displayed prominently on their lapels. Thompson sat straighter, a subtle confidence returning to his posture. Only General Hargrove's solid presence beside Frank offered any reassurance. The record will show that we are now in classified session, Judge Whitman announced. Colonel Thompson, you may proceed with your testimony regarding the K-9 Warriors program and the specific asset designated Caesar. Thompson approached the witness stand with renewed authority, the weight of secrecy clearly a comfortable mantle for him. Your Honor, the K-9 Warriors program represented a breakthrough in military animal deployment. These weren't ordinary working dogs. They were selected for exceptional intelligence and trained using proprietary methods to operate semi-independently in battlefield conditions. And the dog in question was part of this program? The judge asked. Caesar was our most successful subject, Thompson confirmed. His capacity for independent tactical decision-making exceeded all projections. The investment in his training exceeded $7 million. His loss would represent not only a financial setback, but a potential compromise of classified training methods. Frank listened with growing unease. Thompson was methodically establishing Caesar as government property of exceptional value, reinforcing the narrative that Frank had essentially stolen an expensive piece of military equipment. Regarding the incident in Afghanistan, Thompson continued, his voice carefully modulated, the dog was deployed with Sergeant Harrison's unit as a field test of his capabilities. When the unit was ambushed, the dog acted according to his training parameters by assisting the surviving servicemen. However, in the chaos, we lost track of both Sergeant Harrison and the dog. Yet your reports listed the dog as killed in action, Judge Whitman noted. Thompson nodded solemnly. Initial battlefield reports indicated all assets were lost. By the time we determined the dog had survived, Sergeant Harrison was already in medical evacuation to Germany. Given the classified nature of the program, it was deemed appropriate to maintain the KIA designation in non-classified records while recovering the asset through secure channels. And did you inform Sergeant Harrison that the dog had survived? Sergeant Harrison's medical condition precluded any debriefing about classified assets, Thompson replied smoothly. By the time he recovered sufficiently, the dog had been reintegrated into the program. Frank could no longer contain himself. That's a lie, he said, loud enough to carry across the courtroom. I was fully debriefed 6 weeks after the ambush. No one mentioned Caesar had survived. Judge Whitman fixed Frank with a stern look. Sergeant Harrison, you'll have your opportunity to speak. For now, please respect court procedure. Thompson continued as if the interruption hadn't occurred, detailing Caesar's continued value to national security and the proprietary training methodologies that could be compromised if the dog remained with an unauthorized civilian. The technical jargon and security implications mounted, weaving a convincing case for Caesar's return to military custody. When Thompson finally concluded, Frank felt the weight of the system aligning against him. In this rarefied atmosphere of national security and classified programs, what chance did one broken veteran stand? General Hargrove rose to cross-examine Thompson, his approach different from Chen's, less legal maneuvering, more direct military accountability. Colonel Thompson, did you personally verify the casualty report listing Caesar as KIA? Hargrove asked. I reviewed all reports from that operation, Thompson confirmed. So you knew the dog had survived even as the official record stated otherwise? As I explained, it was a matter of compartmentalized information, Hargrove nodded thoughtfully. And when did you decide to transfer Caesar from military deployment to your experimental program? Thompson frowned slightly. I don't understand the question. Caesar was already part of the K-9 Warriors program. Let me be more specific, Hargrove said, retrieving a document from his briefcase. I have here the operational deployment orders for military working dog designation CW7734, signed by Central Command. These orders assign the dog to standard EOD support duties with Marine units. There is no mention of experimental protocols or independent tactical authorization. Thompson's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. General Hargrove is referencing preliminary orders that were superseded by classified directives. Interesting, Hargrove replied, because I also have the classified addendum, which still doesn't authorize the type of training methods evident in the dog's injuries. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I submit that Colonel Thompson unilaterally expanded the program parameters without proper oversight or authorization. Judge Whitman accepted the documents, reviewing them with careful attention while Thompson sat rigid in the witness chair, a muscle working in his jaw. When it was Frank's turn to testify, he approached the stand with a strange calm. The classified setting had one unexpected benefit. He could speak freely about his experiences in Afghanistan without concern for sensitive information. "Caesar was assigned to our unit for a routine patrol," Frank began, his voice steady. His handler, Specialist Cortez, mentioned he seemed unusually alert that day, detecting something our equipment missed. When the first IED detonated, Cortez was killed instantly. The unit was scattered, taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Frank paused, the memories now clearer than they had been in years. I was separated, pinned down behind a collapsed wall. Caesar found me, physically dragged me to a covered position seconds before a second explosion hit where I'd been lying. He stayed with me, guarding my position until medevac arrived. I lost consciousness shortly after. When I woke in Germany, they told me everyone and everything had been lost. "And you believe Colonel Thompson deliberately concealed the dog's survival?" Judge Whitman asked. "I believe Caesar witnessed something in Afghanistan that Colonel Thompson doesn't want known," Frank replied carefully. "Something beyond the standard narrative of an unfortunate ambush." Thompson's attorney rose immediately. "Objection, speculation, and unfounded accusations." "Your Honor," Frank continued before the judge could rule, "Caesar wasn't the only survivor who disappeared after that ambush. Lieutenant Michael Reed was listed on the initial casualty report, but his body was never recovered." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even Thompson seemed momentarily startled by this assertion. "Sergeant Harrison, are you suggesting Lieutenant Reed survived the ambush?" Judge Whitman asked carefully. "I'm saying that two survivors of that ambush were erased from the record, Caesar and Lieutenant Reed. And Caesar is the only one who might know what happened to Reed." Thompson recovered quickly. "This is absurd. Sergeant Harrison is constructing conspiracy theories to justify his emotional attachment to a military asset. Lieutenant Reed was confirmed killed in action." "By whom?" Frank challenged. "Who confirmed it? Because I've reviewed every after-action report, every casualty assessment. Reed's body was never recovered, never processed through mortuary affairs. He simply disappeared from the record." The silence that followed carried a different quality. Not shock now, but something closer to unease. One of the military officers in the gallery whispered to his colleague, both glancing at Thompson with newly assessing eyes. Judge Whitman called for a brief recess. As the court cleared, Frank found himself alone except for Hargrove, who approached with grave concern etched on his weathered face. "Frank, that was a hell of a grenade to throw," he said quietly. "Reed's disappearance is dangerous territory. Thompson has powerful allies who helped bury that situation." "Is it true then?" Frank asked. "Reed survived?" Hargrove hesitated. "There were inconsistencies in the reports, questions that were discouraged at very high levels. Reed was Thompson's protege, his direct report in field operations. If something happened between them, Caesar would have witnessed it," Frank finished. "That's why Thompson needed him back, or silenced." "It's a theory," Hargrove acknowledged, "but without evidence." When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Thompson appeared composed, but his earlier confidence had diminished. Judge Whitman studied both men with increased scrutiny. "In light of these allegations, I'm ordering the complete operational record of the Afghanistan incident unsealed for court review," she announced. "Colonel Thompson, your assertion that this case is merely about recovering valuable military property is increasingly unconvincing." Thompson's attorney leaned close, whispering urgently in his ear. The colonel shook his head once, decisively, before addressing the court. "Your Honor, This proceeding has veered into unsubstantiated conspiracy theories. Sergeant Harrison is attempting to leverage his military service to claim ownership of a dog that represents millions in taxpayer investment. I respectfully request an immediate ruling based on the clear documentation of the dog's status as military property. Judge Whitman's expression hardened. Colonel, I don't appreciate attempts to pressure this court. We will proceed methodically, evidence by evidence. As the judge spoke, a commotion erupted outside the courtroom doors. Voices raised, a woman's sharp protest, the deeper tones of security personnel. Judge Whitman frowned at the interruption. The doors burst open, and Sarah Mitchell strode in, ignoring the bailiff's attempt to intercept her. Behind her, two military police officers looked uncertainly toward the judge. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption," Sarah said breathlessly. "But this can't wait. Caesar is gone." Frank felt the blood drain from his face. "What?" "He was taken from the court handler during the recess," Sarah explained. "Two men with military IDs and transfer papers. They said it was a routine movement to a secure facility." All eyes turned to Thompson, whose impassive expression revealed nothing. "Colonel?" Judge Whitman's voice carried dangerous quiet. "Do you know anything about this?" "I assure you, Your Honor, if the dog has been moved, it was through proper channels," Thompson replied. "Military assets are sometimes relocated for security purposes. Without court authorization, during an active ownership hearing?" Judge Whitman's tone could have frozen flame. "Colonel Thompson, you are dangerously close to contempt." Frank hardly heard the exchange. A cold, sick feeling spread through his chest. Caesar, gone, taken, perhaps already being transported to some classified facility where he would disappear again, this time permanently. "Where would they take him?" Frank demanded, rising from his seat. "Where?" Thompson merely straightened his uniform jacket. "Sergeant Harrison's emotional outburst only confirms my point about his unsuitability as a handler for a specialized military asset." In that moment, staring at Thompson's calculated indifference, something broke inside Frank, the last thread of faith in the system he'd once served without question. Caesar had saved his life in Afghanistan, had found him again against impossible odds, had helped him begin healing from wounds both visible and hidden. And now the dog had been taken, a pawn in some larger game of buried secrets and protected reputations. "This isn't over," Frank said, his voice low but carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. "I will find him." Thompson's smile was slight but unmistakable. "I think you'll find, Sergeant Harrison, that some battles can't be won, especially by one man against the entire military establishment." As Frank turned to leave, Hargrove caught his arm. "Don't do anything rash," the general warned quietly. "We'll handle this through proper channels." Frank met the older man's concerned gaze. "With all due respect, sir, proper channels are how we got here. Caesar doesn't have time for that anymore." Ignoring the judge's call to remain, Frank strode from the courtroom, his mind already racing through possibilities, connections, places where a valuable military asset might be temporarily held before disappearing forever. Behind him he heard Hargrove addressing the court. "Your Honor, I formally request an emergency injunction preventing the removal of the dog from state jurisdiction pending resolution of this case." But Frank knew such measures would come too late. Caesar needed him now, and this time Frank wouldn't fail him. The July heat pressed down on Frank like a physical weight as he burst from the courthouse, scanning the parking lot for any sign of military vehicles that might be transporting Caesar. Nothing obvious, no marked transport vans, no suspicious SUVs pulling away. They would be careful, of course, discreet. Sarah caught up to him on the courthouse steps, still breathless from her rushed entry. "Frank, wait. I know you're thinking of doing something." "I need to find him," Frank cut her off, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Now, before they move him somewhere I can't reach." "I know, but rushing off without a plan won't help Caesar." She gripped his arm. Listen to me. The handler who was watching him, he told me something. The men who took Caesar had paperwork directing them to a temporary holding facility at Westridge Industrial Park before transport to a military installation. It's an old warehouse complex about 20 miles north of here. Frank stared at her. How did you? The handler served with my brother in Iraq. He didn't like how this went down, so he made sure I knew where they were taking him. Sarah pulled out her car keys. I'll drive. Frank hesitated only briefly before following her to the Subaru. Every instinct screamed to act immediately, but Sarah was right. Charging blindly would only get him arrested, or worse. As they pulled away from the courthouse, Frank spotted Thompson emerging onto the steps, surveying the parking lot with narrow eyes before speaking into his phone. Thompson's making calls, Frank said grimly. Whatever window we have is closing fast. General Hargrove is requesting an emergency injunction, Sarah reminded him as she navigated through downtown traffic. If the judge grants it, Thompson will ignore it, Frank interrupted. He's already shown he doesn't care about court orders when it comes to Caesar. Whatever happened in Afghanistan, he's desperate to keep it buried. Sarah shot him a quick, assessing glance. What exactly do you think happened over there? Frank stared out the window, memories crystallizing with new clarity. Lieutenant Reed was Thompson's man, officially attached to our unit as a liaison, but everyone knew he reported directly to Thompson. The day of the ambush, Reed was agitated, arguing with our CO about the patrol route. You think the ambush wasn't random? Sarah said softly. I think Reed knew something was going to happen. Maybe he set it up. Maybe he just had intelligence he didn't share. Either way, he disappeared after the attack. Not confirmed dead, just gone. Frank's hands tightened into fists. And Caesar was there for all of it. Dogs remember, Sarah. They understand more than most people realize. And if Caesar could somehow identify Reed, or indicate he survived, Frank nodded. Thompson's entire career would be at risk if it came out that he covered up what happened, especially if his own man was involved in setting up an ambush that killed American soldiers. The industrial park appeared ahead, a sprawling complex of warehouses and distribution centers, mostly abandoned after the economic downturn. Sarah turned onto a service road that circled behind the main buildings, cutting her headlights as they approached. There, Frank pointed to a nondescript warehouse with a single black SUV parked behind it. No markings, no visible security, nothing to indicate a military presence, exactly as he would have arranged it for a temporary, deniable holding site. Sarah parked a safe distance away, hidden by an abandoned shipping container. What's the plan? We can't just walk in there. Frank studied the warehouse, noting the single visible entrance, the absence of external cameras, the general air of neglect. This isn't an official military site. It's something Thompson arranged privately, off the books. All the more reason to be careful, Sarah cautioned. If this isn't official, they won't be following any rules. Frank reached into the backpack he'd brought from the courthouse, removing a small device and pressing it into Sarah's hand. This is the GPS tracker you put in Caesar's collar after the surgery. Is it still active? Sarah checked the small screen. Yes, he's definitely in there. Moving around, actually. Her expression tightened. His heart rate is elevated. He's stressed. The knowledge that Caesar was so close yet suffering sent a surge of protective rage through Frank. I'm going in. If I'm not out in 15 minutes, call Hargrove. Tell him everything. Frank, wait. But he was already moving, slipping between shadows with the practiced ease of his combat training. The warehouse had clearly been used recently, fresh tire tracks in the dirt, cigarette butts near the entrance. Frank circled the building, finding a loading dock with a partially open bay door on the far side. Dropping to his stomach, he peered under the gap. The warehouse interior was dimly lit, with makeshift partitions creating separate areas. He could make out two figures near what appeared to be a large kennel or cage, and inside, pacing anxiously, was Caesar. Frank slid under the door, moving silently behind stacked pallets for cover. He could now hear the men's conversation. "Thompson wants him moved before that judge signs any injunction," one was saying, a burly man in civilian clothes with military bearing. "The transport is on its way." "Where are they taking him?" asked the second man, younger and clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Need to know basis, kid. And you don't need to know." Frank edged closer, careful to stay hidden. Caesar had stopped pacing, his head raised, ears alert. The dog had sensed something, sensed him. Frank silently willed him to remain calm, not to give away his presence. "This doesn't feel right," the younger man said. "This dog is evidence in an active court case. We could get in serious trouble." "Orders are orders," the older man replied dismissively. "Thompson's got clearance from the top. National security trumps some local judge." Frank had heard enough. There would be no official transport, no paper trail. Once Caesar left this warehouse, he would disappear into Thompson's private network, beyond the reach of courts or justice. He needed to act now. Surveying the space between his position and Caesar's cage, Frank spotted a circuit breaker panel on the wall. One quick movement and he flipped the main switch, plunging the warehouse into darkness. "What the hell?" the burly man shouted. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, sweeping wildly. Frank moved with practiced precision, circling behind the men as they fumbled with the lights. Caesar had gone completely silent, an eerie stillness that spoke of his training. Within seconds, Frank reached the cage. "Caesar," he whispered, kneeling beside the bars. "It's me." The German shepherd pressed against the cage door, a soft whine escaping him. Recognition, relief, trust. Frank examined the lock, a simple padlock he could pick given time, but time was something he didn't have. The lights flickered back on. Frank ducked behind the cage as the burly man strode toward them, flashlight still in hand. "Check the breaker," he ordered the younger man. "And then check the perimeter. This doesn't feel right." As the younger man moved toward the circuit panel, Frank made his decision. No more hiding. No more going through channels that had failed both him and Caesar. He stepped out from behind the cage, facing the burly man directly. "You need to open that cage," Frank said quietly. The man whirled, reaching for a weapon at his waist. "Who the hell are you?" "Sergeant Frank Harrison, United States Marines. That's my dog you're holding illegally." The man's hand settled on his holstered pistol. "Back away now, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing." "This isn't a military facility," Frank replied, taking a step forward. "You have no authority to hold that dog, especially after a judge specifically placed him in court custody." "I have my orders," the man growled, drawing his weapon. "Last warning, back away." Caesar had risen in his cage, a low growl building in his chest as he sensed the escalating tension. The younger man had returned from the circuit breaker, freezing when he saw the confrontation unfolding. "Johnson, call for backup," the armed man ordered, keeping his weapon trained on Frank. The younger man, Johnson, hesitated, clearly conflicted. "Sir, he's right. The judge hasn't ruled yet. Maybe we should—" "I said call for backup," the burly man snapped. In that moment of distraction, Frank moved. 3 quick steps brought him within range, his Marine combat training taking over as he disarmed the larger man with a practice strike to the wrist, sending the pistol clattering across the concrete floor. The man recovered quickly, throwing a punch that Frank barely dodged before countering with a blow to the solar plexus that doubled his opponent over. "The keys," Frank demanded, keeping his position between the gasping man and his fallen weapon. "Now." "Go to hell," the man wheezed. Frank turned to Johnson, who had backed away from the confrontation, hands raised slightly. "You know this is wrong," Frank said evenly. "Whatever they told you, this isn't a legitimate operation. That dog is evidence in an active investigation. Removing him is obstruction of justice." Johnson glanced between Frank and his struggling colleague, indecision written across his young face. Finally, he reached into his pocket and tossed a set of keys toward Frank. "I never saw you," Johnson said quietly. "Neither did Davis. We stepped out for a smoke, came back, and the dog was gone. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it." Frank caught the keys with a nod of acknowledgement. Smart choice. As he turned to unlock Caesar's cage, Davis lunged for his fallen weapon. Frank spun to intercept him, but Caesar was faster. The German shepherd slammed against the cage door with his full weight, the metal hinges giving way enough for him to force his body through the gap. Before Davis could reach the gun, Caesar was on him, not attacking, but blocking, positioning himself between the man and the weapon with a warning growl that needed no translation. Frank quickly unlocked what remained of the cage door, allowing Caesar to retreat to his side. The German shepherd pressed against Frank's leg, body tense but controlled, awaiting command. "We're leaving," Frank announced. "You two have a choice. Let us walk out of here or try to stop us and explain to Thompson how one man and a dog managed to overpower both of you." Davis glared, still winded from Frank's blow. "Thompson will hunt you down. That dog is government property worth millions." "That dog is the only witness to what really happened in Afghanistan," Frank replied. "And Thompson knows it. That's why he's so desperate to get him back." Johnson had moved to help Davis to his feet, keeping a wary eye on Caesar. "What happened in Afghanistan?" he asked despite himself. "Ask Thompson about Lieutenant Michael Reed," Frank suggested. "Ask him how a liaison officer managed to disappear during an ambush that killed an entire Marine unit. Ask him why no body was ever recovered." Davis's expression shifted subtly, recognition, followed quickly by alarm. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but the conviction had drained from his voice. "I think I do," Frank replied. "And soon, so will a lot of other people." With Caesar at his side, Frank backed toward the exit, never taking his eyes off the two men. Only when they reached the loading dock did he turn, helping Caesar through the gap before sliding under himself. Sarah was waiting exactly where he'd left her, engine running. Her face flooded with relief when she spotted them approaching. Caesar jumped into the back seat as Frank slid into the passenger side. "Go," he urged, "before they call for backup." Sarah pulled away, keeping her speed measured to avoid attention. "Did anyone see you? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine. And no one who's going to report it right away." Frank turned to check on Caesar, who sat alert in the back seat, eyes fixed on Frank as if afraid he might disappear. "Hey, boy, you're okay now. I've got you." Caesar's tail thumped once against the seat. Acknowledgement, trust, perhaps even relief. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with controlled tension. "They'll check your house first." Frank had been considering this question since the moment he'd decided to rescue Caesar. "We need somewhere secure, somewhere Thompson wouldn't think to look immediately." His phone rang. "General Hargrove." Frank answered it on speaker. "Harrison, where the hell are you?" Hargrove demanded without preamble. "The courthouse is in an uproar. Thompson's claiming you've stolen classified military property." "Caesar was being held illegally at a warehouse in Westridge Industrial Park," Frank replied calmly. "I recovered him before he could be transported to an undisclosed location. He's safe with me now." A heavy sigh came through the speaker. "You realize you've just complicated everything. Judge Whitman was minutes away from issuing that injunction." "With all due respect, sir, that injunction would have come too late. Thompson was already moving him." A moment of silence. Then, "You're probably right." But that doesn't change the fact that you're now technically in possession of what the military considers its property. Thompson is pressing charges, serious ones. What about the Afghanistan connection? Frank asked. Did you get the judge to unseal those records? That's why I'm calling, Hargrove replied, his voice dropping. Judge Whitman ordered the complete file unsealed for court review. The records clerk just reported that the file is missing from the Pentagon archive. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Frank exchanged a significant look with Sarah. Thompson's covering his tracks. It gets worse, Hargrove continued. I've been making calls to former colleagues about Lieutenant Reed. No one wants to talk about him, and I mean no one. It's like he's been erased from institutional memory. He knows something, Frank said with growing certainty. Reed survived that ambush, and Caesar is the proof. That's why Thompson is so desperate. It's a compelling theory, Hargrove acknowledged. But without evidence, it's just a theory, and meanwhile you're facing potential federal charges. Frank looked back at Caesar, who met his gaze with that same steady intelligence. Caesar is the evidence, sir. He was there. He knows what happened. A dog can't testify, Harrison. No, but he can lead us to the truth. Frank made a sudden decision. I need 48 hours, sir. Before you tell anyone where I am or what I'm doing, just 48 hours to find something concrete. A long pause followed. You're asking me to obstruct a military investigation, Hargrove finally said. I'm asking you to help me expose the truth about what happened to our men in Afghanistan, Frank countered. Caesar risked his life to save mine over there. I owe him the same loyalty. Another heavy sigh. 48 hours, Harrison, not a minute more, and for God's sake, be careful. Thompson has resources you can't imagine. After the call ended, Sarah looked at Frank expectantly. So where are we going for these 48 hours? Frank thought of the one place Thompson would never think to look, a location so obvious it was invisible. Betty Wilson's farm. She's still at the courthouse with the other veterans, so no one will connect her to us immediately, and she offered to help. As Sarah adjusted their route, Frank reached back to rest his hand on Caesar's head. The German shepherd leaned into his touch, a silent communication between two survivors bound by shared trauma and unspoken understanding. We're going to set this right, Frank promised quietly. For both of us. Caesar's eyes, reflecting the afternoon sun, held a wisdom beyond words, the gaze of a creature who had seen humanity at its worst and its best, who had chosen loyalty despite suffering, who had found his way back to the one person who would never abandon him again. Together, they had 48 hours to uncover a truth buried for 7 years beneath layers of official denial and classified reports. A truth that had nearly cost both their lives in the dust and blood of Afghanistan and might still cost them everything in the green summer hills of Virginia. 6 months later, Frank stood before a simple granite headstone in Arlington National Cemetery, Caesar sitting attentively at his side. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain, a peaceful counterpoint to the memories that had brought them here. Well, we did it, boys, Frank said quietly to the marker that bore the names of his fallen squad members. Took us long enough, but we got there. Caesar leaned slightly against Frank's leg, a warm presence in the chill air. The German shepherd's coat had filled out over the months, glossy and thick, though the scars beneath would always remain, just like Frank's own. The past 6 months had transformed both their lives in ways Frank could never have imagined that desperate day at Betty Wilson's farm. Those crucial 48 hours had yielded far more than he'd dared hope, beginning with the discovery Betty made while rummaging through her late husband's military correspondence. Harold kept everything, she'd explained, placing a yellowed envelope on the kitchen table. Letters from handlers all over. This one's from a young man stationed at Bagram in 2014. mentions a training incident with a dog named Caesar and an officer named Reed, says something wasn't right about it. That fragile thread, when pulled by General Hargrove's careful hands, had unraveled Thompson's carefully constructed narrative. The handler's letter led to others who'd worked with the Canine Warriors program, many harboring doubts about Thompson's methods and ethics. One former trainer produced unauthorized photos of Caesar during his initial training, before the scars, before the abuse, with Lieutenant Reed clearly visible in the background. Most damning of all was the testimony of Captain James Collins, Thompson's former administrative aide, who came forward after learning of Frank's legal battle. Collins had processed the paperwork following the Afghanistan ambush, including Thompson's order to list Caesar as killed in action, despite photographic evidence the dog had survived. Lieutenant Reed was reporting directly to Colonel Thompson about unauthorized weapons transfers in the region, Collins revealed in a sworn deposition. The day before the ambush, Reed informed Thompson he had documented evidence implicating several high-ranking officers. He was supposed to deliver that evidence upon returning from patrol with Sergeant Harrison's unit. The investigation that followed moved with the glacial pace of military bureaucracy, but its findings were unequivocal. Thompson had deliberately buried evidence that Lieutenant Reed had survived the initial ambush, only to disappear afterward. Caesar, the only witness to whatever had transpired between Reed and Thompson following the attack, had been hidden away, subjected to enhanced reconditioning designed to erase or suppress his memory of events. Judge Whitman's final ruling had been unexpectedly poetic in its simplicity. The dog known as Caesar CW 7734 is hereby released from military service with honors and granted to the custody of Sergeant Frank Harrison in recognition of their shared sacrifice and service to this nation. Thompson now faced a court-martial on multiple charges, his carefully constructed career crumbling under the weight of revealed truths. Lieutenant Reed's fate remained officially undetermined, though the investigation continued with a new intensity now that the cover-up had been exposed. As for Frank and Caesar, they had found something neither expected to discover again: purpose. "Ready to head back, boy?" Frank asked, placing his hand gently on Caesar's head. The German shepherd looked up at him with those intelligent eyes, then glanced once more at the headstone before turning toward the cemetery path. They walked unhurried through the perfectly aligned rows of markers, Caesar matching his pace precisely to Frank's. No leash connected them. None had been needed for months. Their bond had deepened beyond handler and dog into something more profound, a partnership forged in shared trauma and mutual healing. Frank's truck waited in the parking area, the back outfitted with a custom platform for Caesar's comfort. The magnetic sign on the door read, "Second Chance Canine Training, specializing in veteran service dog partnerships." It had been Sarah's idea initially. "You two have something special," she'd observed one evening as they watched Caesar gently guiding a young veteran with a prosthetic leg across Betty's farmyard. "Something other vets and dogs could benefit from." With seed money from a veteran support organization impressed by Caesar's story, Frank had converted part of his property into a small training facility. They now worked with rescue dogs and veterans suffering from PTSD, creating partnerships that helped both recover from their respective traumas. Sarah had become more than a veterinarian to them. She was a partner in the program, a friend, and gradually something more to Frank. Her car was parked beside his truck now, a reminder of the dinner plans they had for later that evening. As they drove away from Arlington, Frank glanced at Caesar in the rearview mirror. "You know, for a couple of broken-down war relics, we didn't turn out so bad." Caesar's ears perked forward, his expression almost resembling a smile. They headed not to Frank's old house, but to the small farm he'd purchased adjacent to Betty Wilson's property. The elderly woman had become a surrogate mother to Frank, an honorary guardian to Caesar, often sitting on her porch watching as veterans and dogs learned to trust each other in the training field between their homes. The farm came into view as they crested a hill, modest but welcoming, with a newly constructed training barn and several fenced areas where dogs and veterans could work together. A small sign at the entrance simply read, "Welcome home," words that had once seemed impossible to Frank. 3 veterans were already there for the afternoon session, each paired with a dog selected for their specific needs. Frank recognized the focused look in Caesar's eyes. The German shepherd loved this work, seemed to understand intrinsically how to help these men and women struggling with the same invisible wounds he and Frank had endured. "Look who's here," Frank called as they parked. "Our head trainer decided to grace us with his presence after all." The veterans smiled as Caesar trotted purposefully toward the training area, immediately assuming his role as demonstration dog and emotional support for both humans and canines. Frank followed more slowly, exchanging greetings with each veteran, acknowledging their progress, their struggles, their small victories with the understanding that only shared experience could provide. One young Marine, barely 25 but with eyes that had seen too much, knelt beside his assigned dog, a shepherd mix with one ear permanently folded from an old injury. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," he admitted quietly to Frank. "Sometimes I feel like I'm failing her." Frank nodded, remembering his own early days with Caesar. "You know what I learned? Sometimes it's not about us training them. Sometimes it's about them training us to be patient, to be present, to accept love without conditions." The young Marine considered this, watching his dog with new understanding. "Like Caesar trained you?" "Still does, every day," Frank agreed with a smile. "These dogs, they don't care about our mistakes or our broken parts. They just meet us where we are." As the afternoon session progressed, Frank occasionally caught Caesar watching him across the training field. That same steady gaze that had first connected them on a rainy night beside an overturned truck. So much had changed since then, yet that essential truth remained. 2 wounded warriors who had found in each other the path to healing. Later, after the veterans had departed and the evening settled gentle and gold across the Virginia countryside, Frank sat on his porch steps with Caesar beside him. Sarah would arrive soon for dinner, and Betty would likely wander over with one of her famous apple pies, completing the small family they had pieced together. "You know," Frank said to Caesar, watching the sunset paint the autumn trees in fire, "for all the things they tried to train into you, all that tactical decision-making and independent action, I think your greatest skill was one they never programmed." Caesar tilted his head questioningly. "Loyalty," Frank said simply. "Not the kind that follows orders, but the kind that recognizes something worth saving, even when the world says it's broken beyond repair." Caesar rested his head on Frank's knee, eyes closing in contentment. In the distance, Sarah's car turned onto the gravel drive, headlights sweeping across the darkening yard. Betty's porch light winked on next door, a beacon of welcome. The evening ahead promised good food, better company, and the simple pleasure of being understood. Frank placed his hand on Caesar's head, feeling the strong pulse of life beneath his fingers, the connection that had saved them both in ways that transcended explanation. "Second chances," he murmured. "Who'd have thought we'd get one of those, huh?" Caesar's tail thumped gently against the porch boards, once, twice. Agreement, contentment, home. In a world that often forgets our veterans and discards what's broken, Frank and Caesar's journey reminds us that loyalty and connection transcend our deepest wounds. Like many of us in our golden years, both man and dog faced a crossroads where society deemed them used up, damaged, no longer of value. Yet in finding each other, they discovered that our scars don't define us. They simply mark where we've been. Through unwavering loyalty and the courage to fight for what matters, They built a new life, helping others heal, proving it's never too late for a second chance. Their story echoes what many of us know in our hearts. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters of our lives begin after we've weathered the harshest storms. The family they created, not of blood, but of choice, shows that belonging and purpose can find us at any age. Have you ever experienced a second chance that changed your life's direction? Or perhaps formed a bond with an animal that seemed to understand you when no one else did? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.